or get the quote right answers, but I didn't have an intuitive feel, and it lost its appeal to me when it.
But I would kind of blame the teachers, because when you watch like the Feynman lectures, and even if you talk to, and even later in life, even though because I was also a physics major that stopped, but when I would get really frustrated, I remember calling David Adler, who was the head of physics at MIT when I was in high school. And I said, my physics teacher can't explain this to me, but I really think this is how relativity works. And he says, yeah, and he would explain it to me in an intuitive way. And I think that unless you really understand it, you can explain it in an intuitive way. And what happens is I think we have a teaching system where we scale up to a point where the people teaching don't really have an intuitive grasp, so you fall back onto formulae and structure. But I think that the people who actually invent new stuff in physics do have whether it's Lisa Randall, whoever, they do kind of have an intuitive model of everything.
Actually, maybe, Mimi, this was discussion about intuitive ways outside of the classroom and how it sometimes conflicts with inside the classroom. Maybe if you could then move forward from your early childhood experiences to classroom experiences. And again, you were in some different disciplines and different domains, but in what ways did you see sort of that, the connections between your outside of school learning and your inside of school learning, which is obviously a theme in your work today, but I'd be interested as you were growing up, what were the connections for you between outside of school and inside of school?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting growing up with Joey because we are very different learners. So I was always what I call sort of a corporate learner. I did really well in institutionalized instruction, and I was what our teachers now call a pleaser, I suppose, in school. And Joey was a much more interest-based learner. So in a lot of ways, the research I'm doing now that is focused on interest-based learning, a lot is about my observations of Joey and our differences growing up because we were very close, but we had very different styles of interacting with organizations and developing relationships. And so, I think for me, the tie was, it wasn't so much a conflict between what I was doing in school and out of school, but I think the formative experience for me was just growing up in a bicultural environment where, I spent a lot of time sitting outside culture and observing it and trying to understand how it worked. So in a way, I applied that to what was happening in school. Like if you discover and understand the structure of what the expectations are, what the achievements are, how you get recognized, it's not that hard to conform if you feel like doing that. So for me, it was always about cracking the social code and then figuring out what to do with it. And I think a lot of, for me, experiences of being a cultural outsider was really formative to that. Now, I think Joey responded to that same set of circumstances in a really different way, but I think at the end of the day, interest can be broader than, what we usually think of as passion-based learning, but it can be interest in the sense of relevance to your life, right? So the thing, for me, understanding culture was about survival growing up. I had an extreme interest in it because it was highly relevant to what I needed to do to survive as a foreigner in a baffling culture. And we would move back and forth between the US and Japan, so we would get it on both ends. I mean, we never really fit in culturally anywhere. So for me, like becoming an anthropologist and becoming a cultural anthropologist was really built on this formative experience of just highly relevant and motivated learning, even though it wasn't what you would necessarily consider passion or interest-based in the sense of, music or arts or something like that. But it totally shaped what I ended up doing later in life.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really important idea about that interest isn't just something you sort of develop totally on your own. There's just, sometimes when we talk about interest-based learning, a misconception I find, and it's often hard to communicate, if we say we want to move away from traditional classrooms, have more interest-based, it's as if people think, oh, then just leave the child alone and let them do things on their own so they can develop their interest on their own. and that's not all what is meant.
I am. It's weird because can I ask a question?
Yeah,
too?
sure.
So, I mean, because one thing I wonder, because like play was a very important part of my interest, and I didn't think that Mimi had as much play. But I'm curious in your structure, but I do think that also it's the time horizon. Like I couldn't think further than, half a day ahead in terms of my interest. So I just was in pursuit of whatever could immediately feed back, whereas I think my sister could plan further ahead and say, well, if I want to be there, it's kind of like a chess player, then I have to do this and this and this, and she could plan the moves backwards and say, okay, I need to do this. But the question I have is, was there any gameplay in that, or was it anxiety driven, or was it much more like I'm trying, what was the emotional component of that trajectory, the long-term trajectory that you had?
Well, I think a lot of yeah, I mean, I don't think that I would associate the affect of necessarily play as much as, I mean, there was definitely experimentation and play to some extent, but I think you were much more of a tinkerer, experimenter, innovator in the moment type learner. I think for me, it's about sort of gaming in the sense of optimizing, trying to get it's not necessarily planning in the sense that you know where you're going to end up, but if you have systems, whether it's an organization like a school or a game or anything like that, if it's these are rule-bound systems, right? So if you start understanding, culture and society and how they operate, then you can maximize your your gameplay in those systems. So in that sense, even like I do a lot of research on gamers, and there's very different styles of gameplay. Some gamers really get into sort of these more end game kind of forms of playing. Some are much more social and exploratory. And I think even when we talk about play, there's kind of, just like with interest-based learning, I think there is sort of this idealized notion where the affect is about pleasure and fun and exploration. But I think there are other forms of affect that can go with experimentation and inquiry-based learning that don't necessarily have those affective dimensions and that have this, pursuit of excellence or productivity or making contributions to the world, making your best contribution to a collective. These are kind of different affective modes, which, again, to Mitch's point, it is about interest. And we've been using the term relevance much more in addition to interest, just to signal and to have an openness to different learning styles. So it's not that one is better than the other, but I think that different young people have different kinds of affective registers, different things that drive and motivate them. Some young people are driven by the social. Some do have that more individual passion-based thing. Some are driven by play. Some are driven by competition. And, all of these things are part of the palette of what can motivate learning, what can motivate young people to make contributions. And I think the point of, what we've been trying to pursue, at least with our idea of connected learning and interest-based learning, is to really broaden the kinds of entry points, the pathways, the motivations, and the ways we recognize learning so that it can accommodate a more diversity of styles.
Is it ever a challenge, sometimes an issue that people raise with interest-based learning, they would say that, well, some interests lead to a better place than other interests. That they're just, do you want to have sort of equal value to all different types of interests that people might follow? And how does one think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that we're really advocating for is recognizing a broader range of interests as possible pathways to learning and opportunity, because a lot of times we make presumptions about what are valuable interests for young people and what are not. And this isn't to say that all interests are equally valuable, but I think our imagination about what kinds of interests can lead to productive learning is a little bit impoverished still. So that's why, for example, I advocate for gaming and popular culture as arenas that are really, really rich entry points for interest driven and valuable learning. We've seen this, for example, I think there's been such excellent work with hip hop, for example, and the incredible creativity and writing and artistic talent that goes into that, those forms of popular culture that have historically been somewhat underappreciated. I think educators have really stepped up to start building more programs around spoken word and so on that are tying those forms of creativity and learning into opportunity and recognition. I think we're just starting to see that with gaming and popular fan cultures and things like that. And there's so much opportunity there to reach out to young people who have interests that may not be historically highly valued in our culture. I mean, it's not just piano lessons and violin and chess that make kids creative and smart. There's a ton of things that young people are doing in diverse cultural settings that are underappreciated, underexploited for their learning potential. So we've really been trying to advocate for opening up that imagination. But yeah, I think also, Mitch, what you're raising is the important issue that, it's really important to be open and diverse about what we consider valuable learning, but the investments we can make are finite, right, as educators. And so you want to select those games, those forms of popular culture that seem to have the most potential. So, even when I'm looking at young people's worlds in gaming or popular culture, we are selecting for our cases and for our educational interventions ones that seem to have a lot of potential, that seem to have parents and educators starting to connect. In gaming, for example, Minecraft is a really great example that is starting to get a lot of traction in education. We're looking at StarCraft. We're doing a case of WWE. I think that's a underappreciated fandom. This professional wrestling, incredibly interesting from a narrative perspective, very family friendly, which a lot of people outside that fandom don't always realize. So I do think we have to pick to some extent, but I think to the degree to which we can broaden in terms of our cultural palette what we consider valuable forms of interest, it's a big plus in bringing more young people into educational pathways.
One thing I was interested in following up on was, Joey earlier raised the question about time scale. And that's another challenging one. There's certain types of things that as much as we can think it's great to have learning on demand, that when you need to learn something, you dive in and learn it. But certain things, if you're going to do a piano recital and the night before you say, okay, now I'm going to dive in and learn on demand, it probably won't work so well. What are ways of dealing with that challenge of knowing that there are different time scales that are needed for different types of things you might want to do?
Well, I think that, like Mimi's saying, there's different things that, like for instance, as a scuba instructor, there's a really long time scale before you can become a cave diver. But I have my scuba diving lessons and badges chunked in basically 2 or 3 day courses. So you start out with your license and advanced, and then rescue, and then and then side mount, and then blah blah blah, and then cavern, and so there's a reward all the way up, right? And with piano recital, I'm sure you can for the short term types, and again, I really like scuba diving because you have a theoretical thing, and you say, and tomorrow in the pool or today in the pool you will use this, and unless you remember Boyle's law, you're going to drown. But if you don't drown, it's going to be fun because we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and there's always a physical activity, a theoretical component, and a badge associated with each one, and you can literally visualize when that's going to happen. And that ties into big arc. And I could imagine a piano recital, also you could probably chunk it up. Now, some kids don't need it, and so that's why probably we have enough people who are excellent at piano and excellent at going to university who haven't needed the little badges along the way because they can say, oh, in order for me to buy that house, I need to go to